Good morning, good afternoon, buenos días, buenas tardes a los que se conectan desde otros lados del mundo. Vamos a iniciar en aproximadamente un minuto mientras las personas se conectan a la llamada. Muchas gracias. We shall be beginning in around 1 minute. For everybody who is joining, we will be beginning in approximately 30 seconds. Okay. Welcome to the last session of this virtual event. My name is Zenka Piskulich, and I'm the Executive Director of Forever Costa Rica, and I will be moderating this session. Esta sesión va a ser en inglés, así que a todos los que hablan español, los invitamos a usar el botón de interpretación para que puedan usar la traducción. The session will focus on how we can step action on adaptation and resilience by seeking opportunities to integrate nature into global climate initiatives. As we have discussed throughout this event, we are in a critical juncture. This year is a decisive year in which we can step up ambition on the importance of nature as a response to climate change. Momentum is building, with a growing number of countries signing up to the Leaders' Pledge for Nature and the High Ambition Coalition. Also, as we have discussed during these days, integrality and coherency in governance are key factors to ensure the enabling conditions for ecosystem-based adaptation and for nature-based solutions to be adopted and implemented. Many of the panelists throughout these 2 days have recognized the value in achieving synergies across the international conventions and ensuring that they mutually reinforce each other. We have also discussed how the international targets for nature must encompass benefits for livelihoods and for sustainable development goals. Now, we will focus on the how. During this session, we will discuss how the global goal to protect 30% of the ocean and land can be a tool for advancing a green recovery. We will also discuss how a coalition of like-minded countries and decision makers can support this process. Furthermore, we will also discuss some of the obstacles that many countries face in integrating nature and adaptation commitments in their NDCs, and we will explore approaches on how we can overcome these obstacles. In the first segment of this session, we will hear from 2 global experts, Ryan Bartlett and Alice Jay. Ryan is Climate Risk Management and Resilience Director at WWF. He has been working in climate risk and resilience for over 10 years, training WWF staff and partners, developing tools and tailoring climate and ecosystem science for adaptation policy and action. Ryan will offer a short presentation on the integration of biodiversity and climate change in NDCs. Then we will hear from Alice Jay, who is the International Relations Director for the Campaign for Nature at the National Geographic Society. In this role, Alice is leading government relations and communication efforts to achieve a global deal for nature that includes a commitment to protect at least 30% of the planet by 2030, and increased finance for nature-based solutions at COP15 and COP26. Alice will also offer her perspective on the relevance of building coalitions to achieve global environment goals. So we will begin this session with a presentation by Ryan, and then we'll have a presentation by Alice, and we'll have a session in which we can ask questions. So everyone who has joined, please feel free to use the chat button, not only to share your name, the organization you work with, and country, because that is very useful for the panelists, but also to ask any pertinent questions you might have. And if time allows, we will be able to answer a few of those questions. So that being said, Ryan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Zenka, and thank you for the opportunity. It's great to be a part of such a wonderful event. Es un placer de estar aquí con todas y todos. Bueno, to begin, let me share my screen here. Just 1 second. Okay. So I'm just going to jump right into it here. So a few years ago, WWF looked at the NDCs, all of the global NDCs that had been submitted as of 2015 to get a sense of just how well they reflected nature and specifically protected areas and biodiversity. Not surprisingly, or maybe this is a surprise for some of you, the vast majority of the world did not mention the words protected areas or anything similar in their NDCs, a little more than 60%. So on the flip side of that, a little less than 40% actually did include protected areas as part of their climate mitigation and adaptation targets, with about half of that actually calling for expansion of protected areas. You'll see here that Latin America in particular is very well represented. However, when we drilled down on this, we found that very few countries actually included specific time-bound and measurable targets in their adaptation NDCs when it came to protected areas or ecosystem-based adaptation approaches. The University of Oxford did a similar assessment a couple years later, looking at how ecosystem-based adaptation and nature in general was reflected in the NDCs. And they found that only 22 countries actually explicitly included ecosystem-based adaptation in their NDCs. And of the ones that were included, only 17% actually included quantifiable adaptation targets. In other words, there's a lot of qualitative, more general language in these NDCs and the adaptation components. Just to also demonstrate that this is a problem that cuts across mitigation and adaptation. They looked at, for example, forestry, the forestry sector and its mitigation targets through nature-based solutions, and found that of the 70% of countries that actually included forestry, only 20% actually had quantifiable targets, and even fewer than that actually measured it in terms of tons of CO2 equivalent. So it's a problem that across the board, we need to do better to quantify and set rigorous targets. Part of the reason that has not happened is because countries have not either had the funding or the opportunity historically to actually invest in mapping and evaluating and assessing at a national level the contributions of their protected area systems or other conserved areas, lands in general, in supporting adaptation or mitigation goals. So for example, this is just one data point, but only 34 countries are regularly reporting to the UN System of Environmental Accounting on environmental, basically on natural capital and ecosystem services, including biodiversity. Of these, only 5 are in Latin America and the Caribbean. Of course, there's a long history here and some reticence toward economic valuation of nature in Latin America, that there's certainly good reason to be skeptical and understand that perspective. But if we're going to include ecosystem-based adaptation and nature in our NDCs, there's no question that we have to advance in quantifying and measuring just exactly what our protected area systems can contribute in terms of building resilience or mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. And then the other piece of the picture here and partly explains why this is also the case and why nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based adaptation approaches are so poorly represented, is that only 4 to 9 billion, or less than 2% of total global climate finance, actually goes to nature-based solutions for adaptation or ecosystem-based adaptation, based on a report that just came out from WRI and the Global Commission on adaptation. So how do we address these issues? How can we actually make some progress toward integration? Not surprisingly, I'm advocating for the flip side of the challenge of the lack of quantifiable targets. We really need to invest in data to assess and value the natural capital in all of our countries and the biodiversity that is there and supporting such essential ecosystem services that either help people adapt to climate change, build their resilience, or support mitigation. But this is the only way that we are going to get to ambitious and measurable targets that we can hold ourselves accountable to the rest of the world. There's no question we need a huge investment here. And to ensure that these aren't just policies on paper, great policies are hugely important. Obviously, it's what we're talking about. But to make them a reality in country, we really have to start supporting much stronger planning, multi-sectoral, strategic, and spatial land use planning at the national and subnational levels to really find those synergies amongst the goals of different agreements and reduce potential trade-offs, for example, between objectives around 30 by 30 conservation, biodiversity targets under the Convention on Biodiversity, or meeting mitigation and adaptation goals under the NDCs. And similarly, to actually make sure that there is something substantive behind those NDCs and really increasing the role of nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based approaches, we really need to invest in the actual quote-unquote muddy boots conservation, as we call it, or on the implementation side, to actually ensure that we're delivering and maintaining the high biodiversity in some of these protected area systems and other conservation areas. The point here is that managing to deliver nature-based solutions or to deliver resilience for downstream or surrounding communities is a different objective than solely managing for biodiversity. So there's a real need for training and investment and capacity building in protected areas, management and staffing. This is especially important right now in the COVID-19 context, where so much revenue has been lost due to tourism, and some of these departments are facing huge cuts. And historically, we're some of the least well-funded government agencies. So there's a real huge need for investment here as well. So just across the board, for any of this to be successful in each of these areas, we really need to start targeting the private sector for greater engagement. There is no way that we can do this with solely public funding. And we're seeing increased buy-in and ownership from the private sector to embrace different business models that are more nature or biodiversity positive. We also literally need to do the policy harmonization work, crosswalking between targets of the Convention on Biodiversity and the NDCs to figure out where there are synergies, and so that we can make sure that the goals that are listed in both at the national level are as synergistic as possible, so that literally we're identifying the same areas that are supporting high biodiversity and those objectives under the CBD, and supporting adaptation and resilience for millions of people downstream. Obvious huge needs in technical capacity building, particularly around the science for monitoring and evaluating and ensuring that we can deliver, that these systems actually deliver what we're promising, both in biodiversity and adaptation and resilience. And of course, there's a huge need for financing to make any of this possible, especially coming out of this devastating year that really hit a lot of government budgets due to lost tourism revenue in particular. So I will stop there. Thanks so much for the opportunity, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Ryan, for that really great presentation. I would like to ask you a follow-up question to your presentation. So Ryan, despite the progress in integrating biodiversity into these NDCs, what are some of the barriers that you have learned about for this to be implemented by countries? And what are some of the adjustments that could be done?
Yeah, thank you. So I identified some of them there, and I think I would just really reemphasize, there's such a huge need to really collect the data and evaluate what exactly these lands can contribute in terms of adaptation and reducing vulnerability for people everywhere. I mean, we see it I see it all the time in my day job, looking at, for example, concepts for big funding proposals, where we often don't have the data at the country level to really understand how investing in and protecting nature translates to reducing vulnerability for people. In other words, we don't know exactly how many thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people will benefit from investments in these types of areas. So there's a huge need for that across the board. And the global and international community, whether it's multilaterals or organizations like WWF, can really support in this regard by leveraging the technical assistance and the capacity building to support countries in really better understanding what exactly the benefits and services their protected area networks can provide.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ryan. I'd love to move over to Alice. And so, and to learn more about the work that Alice is doing through Campaign for Nature. So Alice, through Campaign for Nature, how can we actually put nature-based solutions into action? Can you tell us a little bit more about the areas that you are working on?
Muchas gracias, Zdenka. Es un placer estar con ustedes en el día de hoy. I'm gonna present in English. Yeah, I think what I'm going to do is talk to you about the work that we're doing, particularly around the target to protect at least 30% of the planet by 2030. And I'm just gonna bring up my screen and share it with you. 1 second. Okay. So yes, I'm gonna present this one example, which is a global ecosystem-based strategy that's gaining a lot of ground worldwide. This is the science-based proposal to protect at least 30% of the planet by 2030. As has been mentioned already in all of these sessions, we're not just facing a devastating biodiversity crisis that's affecting species. This is a threat to our clean air, our drinking water, our food security. And I think this is where we really need to get the message across. This is the destruction of these ecosystems is accelerating climate change, and it's also importantly threatening the prosperity of our communities. And as we've been told earlier last year, 55% of global GDP depends on high functioning biodiversity and ecosystem services. So this isn't some side event. This is something we really do need to take seriously. The good news is the overwhelming scientific evidence shows that protecting and conserving at least 30% of our land and our ocean by 2030 can not only help curb biodiversity loss and climate change, but can also help prevent future pandemics. It can bolster economic growth, it can create jobs, and if implemented correctly, it can strengthen indigenous rights. A recent UNEP WCMC report found that conserving 30% of the land and in strategic locations could safeguard 500 gigatons of carbon stored in vegetation and soils. That's around half the world's vulnerable terrestrial carbon stocks. And at the same time, it would reduce the extinction risk of nearly 9 out of 10 threatened terrestrial species. A study that was just published last week in Nature found that protecting the right marine areas would safeguard over 80% of the habitats for endangered marine species, whilst increasing fish catches by more than 8 million metric tons. This same study highlighted for the first time that the threats of bottom trawling to our climate are serious. They found that trawling is pumping a volume of carbon dioxide into the ocean that's similar in emissions to those of aviation. So we know that global endorsement and collaboration on implementing the 30 by 30 target can have massive positive impact for climate and nature, but that's not all. Protecting 30% is also good for economic growth and can create jobs. A Cambridge study found that economic benefits of protecting 30% of the planet outweigh the costs by a ratio of at least 5 to 1, and that after recovery from COVID-19, the nature sector is actually projected to grow 4 to 6% a year compared to less than 1% for agriculture, timber, and fisheries. A McKinsey report last year also found that 30% protection would support 30 million jobs worldwide in ecotourism and sustainable fisheries, and directly add 650,000 new jobs in conservation management while supporting 500 billion in GDP. So instead of being a challenge for development, protection and conservation is proving to be good for fisheries and food security and good for people and prosperity. Another benefit from ambitiously expanding conservation could be an improvement in Indigenous rights. Science has shown us that Indigenous managed lands have lower rates of deforestation and forest carbon emissions. So supporting IP protected areas, Indigenous and community conservation areas, and Indigenous land rights is an effective ecosystem-based climate and biodiversity strategy. And COP15 and COP26 are an opportunity for increasing IPLC participation and leadership and Indigenous-led ecosystem conservation with free, prior, and informed consent. All of this convincing scientific, economic, and rights-based evidence has led a number of global initiatives to back this 30 by 30 proposal. Costa Rica instigated the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People, and now over 57 countries have joined to back the global goal for at least 30% of the planet to be protected. The High-Level Panel for a Sustainable Ocean Economy and the UK-led Global Ocean Alliance both support protecting 30% of the ocean, and there are now over 70 countries supporting that marine goal. And the UNFCCC post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework in the draft proposes the protection of 30% of the planet for COP15 for agreement under Target 2. And lastly, protecting 30% of the planet and our land and our oceans by 2030 is one of this year's G7 policy priority areas. So there is real momentum behind this goal globally. And the global meetings this year, whether it's the G7, the G20, COP15, COP26, UNGA, there's a real opportunity now to achieve this goal as a viable and crucial ecosystem-based strategy, to divest from nature-destroying activities, to invest in finance for conservation, and to map land and marine conservation so they can be included in the country's adaptation and biodiversity plans. If all of Latin American countries were to get behind the target now, it would benefit people and economies across the region, and it would set a marker to actually inspire the whole world to do more. And that's what our hope is for this year.
Thank you very much, Alice, for that amazing presentation of making the business case and the scientific case for this process. We welcome Lord Zach Goldsmith. Thank you for joining us. Yeah. We have one more question for Alice and Ryan, and then we'll proceed with the ministerial segment as well. So thank you for agreeing to be part of this panel as well. I'd like to follow up with Alice and Ryan with one question for each. So here's a question for Alice. Alice, how can we increase finance for nature-based solutions? Considering all these international venues that you just mentioned, what can we do to increase finance?
Well, one of the things that was very important that came out in the Paulson report last year was that it was found that just 1% of global GDP would be enough if we were to put it into nature-based solutions. So I think that's where we start. I think what's critical in the very near term is that 30% of climate finance is assigned to nature-based solutions, as we see it as 30% of the solution, and ODA needs to be doubled. We've seen the UK really step up this year. It's very nice to see the minister who is the one behind that. France has also really stepped up with finance for nature. And I think it's time for other donors to really step up and follow suit. I think it's crucial that new funds like the Legacy Landscape Fund, which is about to be launched, are really properly funded, but from both private and public sources. And I think it's crucial that governments take action so that they can crowd in private finance for biodiversity. For instance, ensuring governments' policies are aligned with biodiversity, acting as apex investors, or greening government debt, or aligning biodiversity with COVID-19 stimulus measures. I think that all of those things are the way that we need to move forward.
Thank you very much. And then one more question for Ryan. Ryan, how can we best integrate nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based adaptation into national conservation and development policies?
Thanks, Zenka. I mean, just following on what I talked about previously, doing a lot of the strong data and assessment and science work is a critical foundation. But I think other than that, I mean, there's just so much work that needs to be done around awareness raising and sensitization to broader audiences than just those of us that understand the value of nature-based and ecosystem-based approaches for adaptation or mitigation. We need to really start thinking and working with new sectors, private sector, engineering groups, so that we really start to see nature as providing a lot of the same services that we expect, for example, out of the built or engineered world. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to convince a whole broad swath of the political spectrum, coming from the US perspective here, is just one example that, that these systems are important for more than just their recreational or existence values, that they have real benefits in contributing to resilience.
Thank you. Before we move on to the ministerial segment, I would like to offer each of you 1 minute to share your advice to everyone who is listening today. We have a very diverse suite of participants from over 30 countries in Latin America and other places in the world. What would be your last piece of advice for all of the practitioners who are joining us today, some from government, some from private sector, some from civil society, academia, in terms of moving these goals forward and this integrality and synergies that you mentioned, Ryan, and that were also mentioned by Alice. So 1 minute for each. You can start, Ryan.
I was going to punt to Alice so I could go off of her response. Gosh, that's such a big question. I think just following on what I was just saying, always talking about all of these things in the same conversation. So we're not thinking about just biodiversity over here for the importance of the Convention on Biodiversity and the objectives there, or just climate and energy and mitigation over here, or adaptation, that we're always talking about these things in as integrated a conversation as we possibly can, so that we avoid that separate tracks, those separate silos problems moving forward.
Great, thank you. Alice?
Yes, I mean, I think I would start even sort of at a higher level than that, which is we're talking about our survival. We're talking about clean air, we're talking about food, we're talking about drinking water. And I think the more that we can make this just a general survival issue, as opposed to some sectoral, on the side, nice to have issue, is the crucial part of this. I think the climate community managed to achieve that pre-Paris, and I think the biodiversity community really needs to step it up to make that linkage and synergy that Ryan has talked about, and to show these are two sides of the same coin. But I think that what's crucial is action, frankly. And the more we can show how important the integration of natural capital is into our economies, and how critical it is as an opportunity, and that the risk is business as usual, the better we're going to do. And I think that's really the message we need to get across. Business as usual is an absolute disaster.
Thank you very much, Alice, and thank you very much, Ryan. And thank you to both of you for providing a very good segue into this ministerial segment, in which we will discuss this a little bit more as well. And if you could remain there, it would be great. There have been some questions asked in the Q&A in terms of receiving some of the material that you have mentioned in your presentations. That would be great if you could share some of those links to some of those studies. And we will now move on to the ministerial section of this specific section. So I would now like to introduce our next set of speakers. It is an honor to have such a distinguished set of panelists. Lord Zach Goldsmith, Minister for Pacific and the Environment at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office and the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs of the United Kingdom. Ms. Andrea Mesa, who is Minister of Environment of Costa Rica and previously was the Climate Change Director for the Ministry of Environment and Energy. And Mr. Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, who is a former Minister of Environment of Costa Rica and currently CEO and Chairperson of the Global Environment Facility. Thank you for the three of you for joining us for this session. Our distinguished panelists will discuss what it means to put nature at the heart of a transformational green recovery and how we can seize the opportunity that 2021 provides through CBD COP15, COP26, and all these other venues that Alice mentioned as well, to step up momentum on adaptation through nature. I would first like to give the floor to Lord Goldsmith to hear from him. Lord Goldsmith, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Zdenka, and very great to be here with Carlos and Andrea. In my view, you're true champions for nature and people, and it's a real pleasure to join you today. And Latin America is home to a third of all mega biodiverse countries. It's around a third of the world's species, many of them found nowhere else on Earth. The Amazon alone spans 9 nations and supports at least 1 in 10 known species. Colombia alone contains 10% of the world's flora and fauna. I don't think there's any country on Earth with more biodiversity per square kilometer. And Peru has some of the world's most diverse and productive seas, with more species of fish than anywhere else in the world. And throughout Latin America, there are numerous examples of heroic work to protect these wonders of the natural world. Panama's plans to restore, I believe, almost 70,000 hectares of mangroves. In Belize, the Rio Bravo is now part of the largest protected area in Central America, conserving Mayan heritage alongside natural heritage. Costa Rica, which really is an inspiration to all of us, has doubled its rainforest in a generation, putting more than half the country under canopy, boosting businesses and communities, and getting everyone from children to tourists involved. Around 26% of Costa Rica's terrestrial land is already protected. And the country runs on over 98% renewable energy, with an ambitious transport electrification plan as well. I think it's particularly important and inspiring national story because it shows what is possible when you reconcile our economic system with the environment. And ultimately, that is something we're all going to have to do. And we have a lesson then in Costa Rica, which really every country in the world needs to heed. COVID-19 has been a horror, but we know, based on all the scientific evidence, that it is just a small glimpse of the horrific price that we will all have to pay if we continue to destroy nature and destabilize our climate. And although the poorest suffer first and worst as the free services that nature provides begin to fail, none of us will effectively insulate ourselves from the effects of degrading the natural world. It's just not possible. And you're aware of the facts and figures. But it is worth just considering the fact that we're losing today around 30 football pitches worth of forest every single minute, that 1 million species face extinction, including 40% of the world's plants. The grim illegal wildlife trade is now the 4th biggest criminal sector, and that just as we're stripping the ocean of life at a terrifying rate, we're filling it with trash just as quickly. And all of this against the backdrop of an increasingly destabilized climate. Now, there's no doubt that turning this trajectory around is by far and away the defining challenge of our species, of our age. Objectively, it dwarfs all other challenges. And the longer that we dither and delay, the more difficult and expensive it's going to become. And if there's good news, it's that by throwing ourselves into repairing and protecting nature, we're also tackling a whole bunch of other issues: food security, poverty, biodiversity loss, climate change. Indeed, there is no path to net zero or to the Sustainable Development Goals that does not involve protecting what remains of intact ecosystems and restoring the diversity, abundance, and connectivity of the natural world. Globally, nature-based solutions, we're told, could provide around 1/3 of the most cost-effective solution to climate change, as well as protecting lives, creating jobs, and supporting sustainable livelihoods long-term. And every dollar invested, for example, in mangroves, peatlands, seagrasses, and forests pays its way at least 6 times over. So I want to celebrate some of the fantastic work being done in this part of the world, and I sincerely hope the UK will be able to work with you to scale it all up. And in the UK, we are showing, I think, leadership. We're doubling UK international climate finance to 11.6 billion. And over the next 5 years, we will be spending nearly a third of that, £3 billion, on solutions that protect and restore nature, or nature-based solutions to climate change. We're urging all other donor countries to do something similar. On the back of our commitment, we're shortly launching a range of new projects, a new £100 million biodiversity landscapes fund, which is all about protecting global hotspots in at least 5 vast transboundary landscapes covering some of the world's most important ecosystems. And I look forward to making further announcements on that very soon. We're also investing £150 million and leveraging a further £850 million of private finance to protect forests and help communities and economies recover, including in Latin America. And as COP26 presidents, we're putting nature at the heart of our climate ambitions, both domestically in the UK and internationally. And in addition to direct public finance for nature, we're building alliances of countries committed to doing more, in particular to shifting the incentives that governments uniquely control towards supporting nature. So for example, the top 50 food producing countries spend around $700 billion every year, subsidizing often destructive land use. We need to shift that support towards sustainability. The implications of doing so would be huge. We're also asking producer and consumer countries to work with us to clean up global commodity supply chains that are responsible for the vast majority of deforestation. And ahead of COP, we're calling on the main multilateral development banks, including, for example, the World Bank, to get on board. We want them to directly support countries in fulfilling their commitments in the Leaders' Pledge for Nature, but we also want them to ensure that their entire portfolios are aligned with nature and, if you like, nature-proofed. We're working with China as host of the Biodiversity Conference, pushing for the highest possible ambition and mechanisms to hold governments to their promises. And we want to make the most of the first triple COP year for the Rio Conventions since they were created. And part of that involves building alliances of countries committed to protecting at least 30% of the world's land and ocean by 2030. I'm proud that the UK was able to work so closely with Costa Rica on the ambitious Leaders' Pledge for Nature. It's great to see so many of you among the 85 countries, I believe, that have already signed up. And I urge everyone else who hasn't to do so. It is a very powerful document, a very powerful declaration. Latin America is on the front line of climate change and environmental degradation, but the problems that you face are clearly not local, they're global. As Professor Dasgupta makes clear, the whole world relies on the wonders that you protect, from the ocean to the rainforest. So we have a collective responsibility. And my commitment to you is that the UK will continue to step up and to do all we can, both to support your efforts and to amplify your voices wherever we're able to do so. So I want to thank you very much again for all you do. Thank you for inviting me along today, and I look forward to hearing my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Minister, for your leadership, for your country's commitment, and for your very inspiring words. I would now like to ask Minister Mesa for her words as well. Minister Mesa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zdenka, Minister Goldsmith, Carlos Manuel. It's a great pleasure sharing this panel with you. And I'm going to switch into Spanish, considering that this is a message for Latin America, and I'm going to take advantage on that. Creo que estamos en un momento muy decisivo, en una década para transformar nuestras economías en economías descarbonizadas y economías, decimos, nature positive economies, o positivas en esa naturaleza. Y lo que debemos hacer, creo que ya algunas cosas las dijo muy bien el ministro Goldsmith, y lo vemos en el reporte de Dasgupta, es darle ese valor a la naturaleza, verlo reflejado como ese patrimonio, como ese activo que es, y lograr realmente incorporarlo en nuestras finanzas públicas, también en darle ese valor para poder movilizar capital privado. Y es fundamental ser innovadores. Creo que esa es la apuesta que estamos haciendo como Costa Rica. En este momento, una apuesta basada en incrementar el espacio marino protegido, llegar a ese 30% en el 2021, pasando de un 2% de nuestro espacio marino protegido a un 30%. Es una apuesta grande, pero grande porque estamos convencidos que es bueno para nuestra economía azul, justamente, para ese sector pesquero que puede generar mayor valor agregado a partir de tener áreas de no-take, áreas totalmente protegidas, que van a garantizar una pesca sostenible. Y también así llegar a tener igualmente la garantía de un 30% de nuestro espacio terrestre igualmente protegido al 2030, para ser consecuentes con esa visión que estamos promoviendo a través de todas estas iniciativas, en donde estamos en conjunto también con el Reino Unido, desde el Hack for Nature and People hasta el Leaders Pledge, de seguir promoviendo esta meta del 30 por 30. Y esto implica también ser innovadores. Queremos no solo crear estas áreas protegidas en papel, sino diseñar mecanismos financieros interesantes. Y por eso, incluso en este momento, hablando con multilaterales, por ejemplo, con el BID y con el Laboratorio de Innovación, el Nature Lab, estamos también por lanzar con esta idea del Intrinsic Value Exchange, buscar también crear esto que le están llamando empresas o compañías basadas en activos naturales, ¿no? Natural Asset Companies, como parte también de esa apuesta para buscar movilizar igualmente capital privado. Necesitamos que nuestros servicios ecosistémicos sean considerados, tengan un valor en nuestras cuentas públicas y privadas que nos permitan también movilizar estos recursos, ser igualmente consecuentes con esas políticas públicas, ese alineamiento, dar señales claras al mercado, qué cosas vamos a permitir, y en esa línea también de incentivos y desincentivos en nuestras cadenas de valor. En este momento tenemos la posibilidad, por ejemplo, nosotros igualmente como un país productor de ciertos commodities agropecuarios, de buscar consolidar que estos commodities sean libres de deforestación. Y así, por ejemplo, estamos tratando de consolidar un mecanismo a través de una herramienta como el MOCUP, que nos permita justamente identificar cuándo logramos consolidar commodities libres de deforestación. Y con una herramienta de este tipo, no solo pensar en castigar a quien identifiquemos que deforeste, sino premiar a quien haga bien las cosas. Y estamos hablando con el Ministerio de Comercio Exterior también para justamente poder consolidar este tipo de esquemas coherentes, donde veamos esta visión de una manera muy integral con nuestro modelo de desarrollo. Al final es ver a la naturaleza como parte esencial, como un activo más, además de esos recursos humanos, además de esos otros activos que tenemos y del patrimonio, ver a la naturaleza como parte esencial también de nuestros activos a nivel país y darle ese valor para que sean parte fundamental de ese modelo de desarrollo. Bien lo hemos hecho estos últimos 20, 30 años con esa apuesta y el desarrollo de una nueva industria como fue el turismo, y ahora nos toca igualmente garantizar el cuidado especialmente de nuestros océanos. Ahora esa es la nueva frontera, pero igualmente de estos esquemas terrestres, y apuntalar entonces a crear, estamos con esa línea, a crear una nueva NAC, eso que les decía, un Natural Asset Company, como parte incluso de esa innovación que queremos para movilizar recursos y traer dinero también a garantizar la protección de nuestros ecosistemas. Yo lo dejaría ahí, Zdenka, de momento, y encantada de compartir el panel.
Muchísimas gracias, Andrea, por tus palabras. Switching back to English for a moment, I'd just like to say that, and to emphasize what you mentioned just now, that we had the presentation from Professor Dasgupta today in the morning, and it was focused on ecosystems as assets. And he gave really good data to justify that. So your comments are right on track with what we have been learning about today. Now I would like to give the floor to Carlos Manuel Rodriguez to share his thoughts as well.
Well, thank you so much, Zdenka, and it's a great pleasure and honor to be here with these distinguished world leaders, Minister Goldsmith and Minister Mesa. And I've been asked to talk about what kind of incentive packages the country needs to really position nature-based solution in the context of the overall sustainability goals. And even though I strongly believe that these questions was framed with a financial thinking behind it, the most important incentive that countries do have in order to do the system change is one, human health, and second, political stability, as simple as that. And we got in front of us a huge challenge to really, position these topics as a major issue in terms of human health and political stability. Jay, in the previous panel, mentioned that, yeah, we're running out of clean air and clean water. And even though this seems like something so basic, it is the underlying element that we need to be able to position. And yes, of course, political stability is a major issue. And what happened with the pandemic show us how vulnerable, socially speaking, we are at the global level. So social unrest will magnify many more times from what it is right now because of the impact of biodiversity loss and climate change. So that connection is critically important. But going more to the lines of what Mr. Goldmith and Ms. Mesa said, I tend to believe that two elements here are very important. One is that there is no real possibility to really narrow the global financial gap by just putting more pressure to the north, to the industrialized societies, even though they can and will most probably support like never before in time. Those resources should be considered as resources that catalyze domestic processes in terms of more coherence, policy coherence, and more integration, as Minister Goldsmith was saying. So one key element here is that countries do understand that in the context of healthy people and a politically stable society, investing in our natural capital is important. And as you see the numbers coming from different projects, BioFin, the finances of biodiversity, are telling a very interesting story that countries at the local level have a lot of resources that are being invested probably in not the most strategic or efficient way, but through international aid, we can work hand in hand with countries to optimize and mobilize domestic resources. These are public expenditures, as Minister Mesa said, private sector resources at the country level that can make the difference in terms of the huge financial gap that we have in front of us. But also that huge financial gap, biodiversity or climate can be narrowed more than in half if we help countries be more coherent in the way they set their policies. Because, as let's talk about the forest sector. Globally, we invest, I think, 150 times more resources and activities in development activities that generates deforestation than what we invest in forest conservation. So we really need to understand how that happens. And if we see the circumstances at the country level, let's work with the public development banks. And the same way that northern countries are doing it with the fossil fuel industry in the tropical southern countries, we need to do that with respect to land use and land use change. As we decrease those negative investments and generate and phase out perverse and incentives and subsidies, the need for extra finance will decrease dramatically. And the last point here is that yes, as the Dasgupta report has said, we got a huge global market failure. There's another, the Dasgupta report touched on something that we need to continue working, which is the other big failure, which is the institutional failure. The way we have organized our governments through the different agencies keep on planning, budgeting, and developing actions based on sectors and agenda that doesn't complement with each other. You know, the conflict of vision and agenda within the ministries of environment and the mining and energy ministers, the classic confrontation of ideas within the ministers of agriculture and environment is another big element. So we need to work based on the fact that we won't be able to do the leap forward in terms of our sustainability goals with the same institutional framework that in first place has created a problem that we want to solve today. So there's an institutional failure there. There's a lot of very interesting countries doing innovative actions, and in the UK, without any doubt, to me, it's very interesting with DEFRA, where the nature and food systems are brought in the same ministry, which give us an impression that more coherence will be generated out of those institutions. And the case of Costa Rica is a good example. Andrea is the Minister of Environment. Yes, we all know that, but also she's the Minister of Mining, she's the Minister of Energy, she's the Minister for the Oceans and Water. So Costa Rica and the UK has two good examples of how they've been integrating the institutional framework in a way that can give us an expectation for more policy coherence and more holistic approaches. I tend to believe that these two countries are trying to move your institutional framework towards what I would call a landscape institutional framework or an oceanscape institutional framework, breaking with those silos. So I tend to believe that that is another key element that we need to put into the context of the market failures and the challenges associated to the economic system. Thank you, Zdenka.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carlos Manuel, for your comments. And something very important, because throughout these 2 days, we have been learning a lot about this issue of lack of coherence amongst institutions, amongst enabling conditions that sometimes makes us be in a fight within the same country, within the different institutions that are there. And I know it is a word that Minister Mesa constantly uses, coherence, and I think it really applies to what we are talking about here today. I would like to follow up with another question for Lord Goldsmith. What messages do you have for Latin American countries to support the process of making nature an important part of the climate solution? What more needs to happen to give the preservation of biodiversity the importance it deserves?
First thing I'd say, thank you for the question. And the first thing I'd say is that there are countries within Latin America who are shining examples. So you get best practice. I mentioned Costa Rica earlier, but it is the obvious example. It's a country that is so far ahead of most countries. So I think that in and of itself is incredibly valuable. I don't remember having given a speech on these issues anywhere in the world where I haven't pointed to Costa Rica and said they managed it. And of course, we all have more to do. Even Costa Rica has more to do, but it's shown what is possible. So that is valuable in and of itself. But I think there are particular areas where Latin America can take real leadership. So for example, in ensuring that as we move towards creating high integrity carbon markets, there's a real role there, I think, for Latin America, many of whose countries are forest countries, to ensure that we get that right. You know, it is potentially a mechanism that can deliver vast amounts of money as a solution. You could get money flowing from the private sector into forest countries on a scale that is much greater than anything that governments can provide, but we need to get it right. We need high integrity, quality control, both at the demand side and the supply side. And I think there's the voice of Latin America in that process is going to be incredibly valuable. I think Latin America is in a fantastic position to make the case for, and also to increase its efforts to protect the marine ecosystem. So particularly critical habitats like coral reefs, mangroves, kelp, seagrass. But we've seen that where you create marine protected areas, you benefit livelihoods. So often the first people to oppose the creation of marine protected areas are fishing communities, but they're often the greatest supporters of marine protected areas where they're done properly, because they increase yields. So I think there are lots of areas where the Latin America can provide real leadership. But I have to say this as representing a country that's hosting COP. We're not going to succeed in getting maximum ambition either out of COP or the CBD without partnerships, without coalitions. So my number one ask would be just please work with us. We need as many countries as possible with high ambition to work with us to clean up the financial system, to get the multilateral development banks to go nature positive, to shift those agricultural subsidies so that instead of destroying land, they support nature, to clean up the commodity supply chains, to break the link between commodity production and deforestation. Latin America's voice is so powerful, and the more support we have, the more we can work with you, the more likely it is at the end of this year that we really will have done something to turn the tide on these grim trajectories that we've been talking about so far.
Thank you very much. I'd like to follow up on that question with Minister Mesa, because you mentioned Costa Rica as an example. And Costa Rica, of course, also co-leading the High Ambition Coalition and other initiatives at a global scale. Minister Mesa, how can small countries such as Costa Rica play a role in bringing others on board to this agenda, even larger countries, developed countries?
Gracias, Zdenka. Haciendo cosas. Yo creo que necesitamos acción, necesitamos demostrar, continuar demostrando que es posible consolidar bienestar y una economía que genera empleos, que genera bienestar, basada justamente en esto activo, en estos patrimonios naturales. Eso es un elemento fundamental. Costa Rica como un país pequeño, pero que todavía tiene muchos retos. Bien lo decía el ministro Goldsmith, y sí hemos hecho algunas cosas bien, pero todavía tenemos retos fundamentales, y es efectivamente con esa posibilidad de hacer innovación en la gestión pública, innovación en la movilización de recursos públicos y privados. Carlos Manuel lo decía antes, no vamos a lograr hacer estas transformaciones pensando que lo vamos a hacer solo con fondos de la cooperación. Sí, es muy necesaria la movilización de esos recursos y la cooperación es fundamental, pero solo logramos los cambios estructurales cuando generamos condiciones habilitantes en nuestros países, cuando damos coherencia, cuando damos seguridad jurídica también para la movilización de capital privado, y estos son parte de todas esas condiciones vitales. Creo que en el caso de Costa Rica es seguir con la coherencia, como digo, es una palabra que me parece fundamental, ese alineamiento de las políticas públicas y de las condiciones habilitantes para hacer que efectivamente la naturaleza sea parte esencial del proceso de descarbonización y de ese proceso de transformar nuestras economías en esas economías nature positive o positivas en naturaleza. Así que creo que ese es el rol. Seguir también, así como si cuando hacemos las cosas como un país pequeño y un laboratorio vivo, un living lab, tenemos también la condición moral de poder exigir esto también a los países grandes, y creo que ese es un elemento también fundamental. Yo nada más efectivamente decirle al ministro Goldsmith y a Fiona y a todo el equipo de UK que cuenten con nosotros, que nosotros estamos aquí justamente para seguir haciendo alianzas en esa máxima ambición, porque creemos que esto es bueno, y lo hacemos porque estamos convencidos de que esto es bueno para nuestro planeta, para nuestras personas y para justamente nuestra prosperidad, ¿no? Cuando estuvo Alok Sharma aquí recientemente, tuvimos una reunión con los ministros de planificación y con el ministro de Comercio Exterior, y mucho de la estrategia de atracción de inversión extranjera directa del país, el ministro de Comercio Exterior lo explicaba, está basado en ese concepto de Planet, People and Purpose, que muchas de estas inversiones que se hacen en el país están basadas justamente en que cada vez más los inversionistas están buscando estos entornos saludables, esta visión integral. Así que creo que ese es el rol de un país como el nuestro, que está apostando porque está genuinamente convencido que esto es lo positivo para la prosperidad de nuestros ciudadanos.
Muchísimas gracias, ministra, por esas palabras. Quisiera cerrar. I'd like to close with Don Carlos Manuel Rodriguez. You talked a little bit about the incentive package that is needed to see greater action on nature-based solutions. How can the Latin America region contribute to the global agenda on climate change?
Well, first of all, let me say that Latin America has been a key leader and contributor in all the many different multilateral environmental agreements, and I don't expect less from GRULAC in the incoming processes, and this is a mix of reasons. One is that Latin Americans recognize that that they own the large global environmental assets of this planet, and this does implies an added moral responsibility. That, by the way, they've been using it as a very interesting bargaining piece in all the international negotiations. But now, in the context of COVID-19 and probably talking about the aftermath of COVID-19, Latin American and the Caribbean nations has a great opportunity to do a green, blue, clean, resilient recovery, and they do have the institutional capacities, they do have the human capacities, they do have the resources. I mean, they are one of the most big players in supplying raw material to the planet. So there's a lot of income associated to that management of those resources, and that means that they can improve their capacities in the mobilization of resources and the needed reforms at the legal and institutional level to be able to keep on leading by example. Nevertheless, as Minister Mesa, Latin America, as with the case of Costa Rica, we've got big issues, pending issues. Costa Rica, as like the rest of Latin America, has been solving or dealing with environmental problems, which were basically located in rural and remote areas, but most of Latin America is becoming an urban society, and we haven't invested much in green and sustainable cities. So there's an open agenda over there. And yes, we talk a lot about land degradation, climate change, and biodiversity, but let me bring to your attention that there's another environmental element that is there. We don't put much attention, and for me, keeps on being the largest, by far, environmental problem at the global level, which is water pollution, toxic pollution, solid waste, and plastic pollution. We got the different chemicals conventions. Unfortunately, they are not on the spotlight as the Rio Convention in political terms. But if we are able to phase out and deal with the pollution, the chemical pollution, we will solve all the problems related to climate change and biodiversity loss and land degradation. So here, the words of Minister Goldsmith in terms of integration is critical. Integration at three levels: integration at the level of the multilateral environmental conventions, integration on the multilateral financial funds like the GF, and this is what we are working in GF8. We're doing a leap forward and integrating in a coherent way the way we support financially countries. And yes, and extremely important, the integration at the country level, where I was mentioning, the lack of policy coherence or the challenges associated to policy coherence. If we are able to really work on those three levels, we may do, strong steps in the right direction and be within the context of our political aspiration of doing progress in the next decade.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carlos Manuel. I think that is a perfect conclusion to what we have been discussing: integration at all levels. Just to close this session, I would like to mention some of the keywords that I heard throughout your presentations. First, it is not enough to only narrow the financial gap. We need to invest in natural capital. It's fundamental to do that. Second, we all need to work together. Multilateralism, as Mr. Carlos Manuel Rodriguez mentioned, is key, as is work within countries and within the institutions in each one of these countries. Third, we need to be coherent, and that needs to be reflected in the enabling conditions to make this happen. We cannot only walk the talk. Fourth, we all have a role to play, and it's something we have been emphasizing throughout this whole 2 days of meetings. We all have a role to play, whether we're working at a very local scale in a specific community or whether we are actually leading a country. And the last one is, we all recognize that investing in natural capital is fundamental, and that instead of being a challenge, investing in natural capital is investing in people. So these are some of the takeaway messages that I have, and I would like to thank you all for sharing not only your knowledge in all these topics, but also very concrete examples and concrete commitments that are being made by each one of these countries. And of course, thank the government of the United Kingdom and also of Costa Rica for being true leaders in this process as we move forward in integrating environmental ecosystem-based adaptation and climate change into all of these agendas. Thank you very much for joining us today for this session. And with this, we would conclude this specific session. I would also like to thank Alice J. and Ryan Bartlett, who joined us and who gave the context before the ministerial segment. Thank you all for joining us. We will now move to the conclusions. Bye-bye. For the rest of you who remain, we will now move to the conclusion of this whole virtual event. It's hard to believe we're at the end. It has been an amazing journey of learning and understanding for all of us. I would like to just give a few conclusions before we finish. And to begin, I would like to actually quote something that Ambassador Fiona Clowder said yesterday. In her opening remarks, she said, please think of what action you will take, wherever you are. All of us can help address the future challenges of climate change. You, both collectively and individually, have the potential to make a change. Throughout these 2 days, we have learned about ways in which each of us can take action. We first started learning about the why it is important that we take action. Today, we moved into the how can each of us take action? And through the process, we learned the role that each of us, the who, can play in this process. We learned about action that is being taken at a country level. And in that, I would like to once again recognize the government of the United Kingdom for being a leader towards COP26 and for organizing an event to help us all understand how we can all be a part of this. Also, action that is being taken by the different climate change departments. Today, we heard from amazing women leaders who are moving the climate change agenda in each one of their countries. In Latin America, we learned about action being taken by organizations and by people in the field. Yesterday, we had the opportunity to learn about experiences in Guatemala, in Paraguay, in Colombia, in Peru, in the mountains, in the ocean. So we have learned how, at a very local level, we are also taking action. And then we have today moved into international scale, and how at an international scale, we also have the potential to take action. And thank you to Alice, who gave us that overview of all the different events that are happening besides COP26 and biodiversity conference happening this year, in which there is the capacity for us to move forward with multilateralism, which is a really key word in all this aspect. And I thank Alice for emphasizing it, and Minister Rodriguez as well. Words that really stood out throughout the whole event: multi-sector work, multilateralism, working on developing synergies, ensuring that we have the capacity to harmonize where we are working, complementarity, and then specific tools that we're going to need to move this forward: technical assistance, capacity building, investing in capacity building in both science, but also in the people. I really liked the comment yesterday by Manuel Pulgar Vidal, who said, we need to bring these ideas down to the people. We need to make this concrete. If we are still here learning ourselves, how do we make sure that we also teach others about the importance of ecosystem-based adaptation? And at the end, sustainability. And sustainability is all about people. And I'm very happy to see that throughout these 2 days, we were able to provide examples from people for the people. So with this, I conclude with a few ideas of what has happened and transpired in these past 2 days. Before I give the floor to Ambassador Fiona Clowder, I would like to thank the government of the United Kingdom for their leadership, for bringing us all together here in Latin America to learn more about this topic, and for their leadership towards COP26. I would also like to thank the British Embassy in Costa Rica for all their support in this process, especially Anne Acroft, who really supported and helped us put together this agenda. I would also like to thank our curator, Bernal Herrera, who has been supporting us in putting together this agenda, as well as our staff in Forever Costa Rica, especially Maria Luisa Hernandez, who is behind the scenes, and Pia Pavi, who has also supported with all of the technical content. Once again, I would like to thank our interpreter, who has done an amazing job. Alfredo, thank you so much for helping translate throughout these 2 days. And of course, Island Innovation and James, who have been behind this whole process. With that, I would like to give the floor to Ambassador Fiona Clowder, who's the Regional Ambassador for Latin America and the Caribbean for the COP26 presidency, to close this event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zenka, and thank you also to all those who've been involved in this event, both in its organisation, but also all of you as participants. It's been a very, very rich discussion. There's just been an excellent summary of the proceedings, so I'm not going to duplicate that. But just to reiterate my message of action, we've got less than 8 months to go before COP26. That is a pivotal moment really for the world. It's where we all come together to really make a difference. And it's the legacy that's established from that meeting that is ever more important. So this has been a tremendous meeting where we've heard from many experts across the region. We've heard of the different perspectives from government, from science, from the private sector, from NGOs. We have all learned so much. Please, please do not just think that's that done, what's my next event, what's happening in my inbox, etc. It's all too easy for us all to do that. Please take a moment to reflect on these 2 marvelous days and think about what you can do in your role, in your sphere of influence, to take forward this agenda. Because one thing this meeting has achieved is to really put a greater spotlight on nature and biodiversity and how crucial they are for adaptation and resilience to climate change. And also looking at this both from the environmental angles, but also for the economic angles. And so let's all come together. And perhaps one of the great things about this meeting is us all getting to know one another, forging new links, new collaborations. Let's build on that for COP26. So thank you. And finally, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Anne Acroft, and also to thank her and my colleagues in the embassy in Costa Rica, who've been so instrumental in pulling together this wonderful regional event. Anne, over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I can't see myself, so I don't know if I'm online.
Go ahead, Anne.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. On behalf of the British Embassy in San Jose, I'd like to extend a heartfelt thank you to all of those involved in making this 2-day event a reality, and I dare say a resounding success. When we first started thinking about organizing this event, we knew 2 things for sure. One, that we wanted to encourage discussion around ecosystem-based adaptation and the economic benefits of protecting our biodiversity. And 2, that we certainly were not experts on these issues. We are therefore indebted to a host of people for making this event happen, from colleagues across the UK government network, the offices of Ministers Trevelyan and Goldsmith, Sir Das Gupta and his brilliant team, from experts in UNDP and the UN Climate Champions team, and of course, our partners, Costa Rica por siempre. There were other experts too, who stepped in as advisors, sounding board, and willing participants and experts. In Spanish now. A los participantes y panelistas, quisiera asegurarles que sus valiosos aportes formarán parte de los insumos que enviaremos a nuestra capital para que los tomen en cuenta en sus preparativos para la COP26. Para finalizar, quisiera extender un agradecimiento muy especial a la ministra Andrea Mesa, cuyo compromiso y colaboración con nuestra embajada ha sido invaluable. El Reino Unido reconoce que Costa Rica es un socio valioso en esta área y esperamos seguir trabajando de cerca con ustedes, así como con otros países que comparten nuestra visión para abogar por acciones globales más ambiciosas en materia de mitigación, adaptación y financiamiento. De nuevo, muchísimas gracias a todos.